Okay, everyone, thank you. I hope you can find a seat. If you can't find a seat, I'm told, the stairs are the next best thing. Oh, you got that corner one there. I think there's one left here. That's about it. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. For those of us who had a late last night and a long first session, my name is Bob Anibale. I'm at Citi, and I head up our microfinance and community development. And in that realm, we also look at the newer and very much interesting area of value chain finance. And I think we'll introduce in a second how and where we're trying to discuss that, because it's quite a big subject, as you all know. And you could begin at any end of it. But let me first also introduce, please come on in. You may have to find stairs or whatever. I'm going to let the four speakers introduce themselves briefly, really briefly. And what I want to do is to set the stage, because we want to not use too much of our time in a sort of, managed dialogue, but because there is such a rich room of knowledgeable folks here who I think can both participate and speak in the conference, that we'd like to be able to have that time, much more of that time. From a housekeeping perspective, I'm told to everyone, we're all starting a half hour late, and the whole day will move up except for the awards, which will still start on time. So this will continue. We have the extra half hour. Lunch goes that extra half hour, and it works its way right up till the end of the day. Edwin is right here, Edwin O. I don't know if you know from Skoll, and I think for this session, and if there are issues and ideas about it, or things we'd like to follow up on, or any other logistics even about Skoll, I think Edwin's really been our key man for this series. They've asked, of course, the silence of all phones. Social media, if you're looking for Twitter, hashtag, for those of you who are desperately looking for that, it's a number sign, whatever that, hash, Skoll.org. So please, here we are. You can Twitter away. My staff here too, everybody, that's Twitter. I don't know how to Twitter well, but they do. They always tell me, we've tweeted for you. So we continue, and then there's going to be a continued conversation in the Cisco CoLab in the Said rooms 12 and 13 for those who do want to carry on networking. I think that space has been made available going forward. And I'm comfortable that as we go through and people speak here, and we'll see how they go, we'll just do the first walkthrough. But then if there are really pending questions as people speak or interjections, as long as you can help me to keep that flow going, we won't keep it overly structured. So first, I'm going to just ask, let me set the stage. So when they introduce themselves, they can address something more specific, because they all have wide responsibilities. And there was a slide, I think. Do you have that on the slide that was floating about? Or maybe not. On value chain. One of the areas that most of us were focusing on when we had this discussion around this series, and this focus was, we start at the end of a long value chain of let's think of products and produce, and we can start from the angle of production and to consumption. Of course, there's all kinds of value chains. There's ones that flow both directions. But if we start with that, many of you would think of coffee, you'll think of cocoa, you'll think of commodities usually. And you often think of exports. They could also be, of course, for production for cities and for domestic markets, very important too. Wide range of subjects. For most of us, we were all thinking, what brought us often together was the part of the value chain that has to do with increasing incomes for small stakeholder production, really small producers. And I think these gentlemen, ladies, will give you a better sense of the range of what they mean by that. But we're really talking about family, few hectare type, is that right? Type production. People who are often living just, very much on the minimum end of it, and having trouble through the cash flow. We could almost say that what is in common of small producers often the long cycle time and the peaks and troughs of having cash with a cash crop. So what brought us together was very much thinking about how to increase the livelihoods, and how do they benefit more from many of the global demands, whether it's domestic or international. But we see in the prices, we see in the commodities, we see in our changing behavior as consumers in countries such as the United Kingdom, where fair trade products are at a premium, certified products. We have many others, ways of certifying, but we're more selectively buying and wanting to have traceability very often back to the source of production. So we are very much kind of think about that far end of the producer in this discussion, as opposed to the long chain of all the types of financing that one could talk about in connecting the two. So let me introduce first Dana Bogus from Gates. And I'll let you introduce yourselves. I'm just going to walk down through. You can see across the room. And then we have Rick Paveser he's from interesting Green Mountain. Coming up, there you are. And everybody's moved from my great plan here. And where's Gary Milstead? I'll just jump back here. Gary is at Nestle. And then Willie Foote, for some of you will know, is at Root Capital. Okay? So I'm going to let each of you do a quick introduction to yourself, and then we'll get into the dialogue. Dan.
Sure. So my name is Dana Bogus from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I'm a program officer on our agricultural development team. I manage a portfolio of grants related to cash crop value chain development, specifically with the smallholder in mind. The main areas that I've worked in so far are coffee and cashew, so most of my examples today will come from those sectors. But then I've also made a couple of investments on behalf of the agricultural development team with the intention of creating a different set of incentives that grants create for a different set of actors, so financial intermediaries who are contributing to developing the agricultural value chain as well.
Good morning. My name is Gary Milstead. I'm head of procurement for commodities in Zone Europe for the Nestle organization. Previously in my role, I was globally responsible for coffee sourcing. So part of why I'm here today is to talk about what's being done in terms of the embodiment of the creating shared value principles of Nestle into the coffee sector. And what does that mean for producing value, especially at farmer level, especially when you're talking about smallholder farmers, over the medium to longer term, how we can contribute as a player in the coffee sector to improve farmer income over the medium to longer term.
Good morning. My name is Rick Pizer. I'm Director of Social Advocacy and Supply Chain Community Outreach for Green Mountain Coffee Roasters. Green Mountain contributes 5% of its pre-tax earnings to projects and communities where we do business, and about half of that is put to work in the U.S., the other half is put to work in our global supply chains, and it's my responsibility to oversee the implementation of projects, particularly in coffee communities with small-scale farmers.
Morning, I'm Willie Foote, and I'm with Root Capital. We're a nonprofit agricultural lender that uses kind of capital and financial training to help connect with these folks, isolated smallholder farmers in developing countries to reliable, well-paying markets. So our mission is to grow real prosperity by investing in agricultural businesses that build sustainable livelihoods in Africa and Latin America. So it's a social investment fund we founded about a decade ago to try to address the missing middle, if you will, of rural finance. So businesses that might aggregate hundreds or thousands of smallholder farmers, but that are too big for microfinance and too small, too risky, too remote for the bank. So we do three things. We provide capital to those businesses that are locked out of the banking system. And a lot of it is around, you don't see the value chain diagram here, but lending through those value chains. And as a lender, positioning ourselves between the buyer and the seller. We second build local capacity through financial management training. So folks with little to no formal business education, i.e. the management team of a cooperative or of a private enterprise, can better compete in global or regional or domestic markets so that they can track their cash flows, create the financial statements they need to access capital. And then the third thing we do is really try to crowd in competition by kind of encouraging other lenders, both commercial lenders and social lenders, to see opportunities in the countryside. And we're also trying to really help set standards and best practices for what you might call kind of the nascent industry that is agricultural finance for smallholder farmers. The last thing I'll say is that we really are an impact-first agricultural lender, if you will, and that we're very explicit about making trade-offs, for lack of a better term, in terms of maximizing mission and social impact versus maximizing financial return. And so that is to say we are focused on the earlier stage agricultural businesses really out there at the end of dirt roads, deep in the countryside. Call it the high-risk, low-return sweet spot, if you will. So thank you.
Okay, great. Dana, we spoke a bit. Gates has worked on a wider range of issues regarding, supplier and production, right from the pre-production stage to accessing markets. And I think you were able to help discuss that a little bit helpfully with us the other day. And in terms of the areas that you're particularly focusing on, this spectrum of trade finance that leads to the earliest stages of production. Can you give us a sense of where you're focused?
Yeah, so many of you are probably familiar with the Gates Foundation's work in the agricultural development space, and it's very broad. It ranges from really far upstream R&D into seed varieties and other technologies that will help the farmer, all the way down to understanding markets and trying to draw buyers into closer and more sustainable relationships with smallholders. And we spend a lot of time thinking about the whole host of obstacles facing smallholders, whether that's access to inputs, because of physical availability, not just because of financing constraints, whether that's access to knowledge, whether it's access to, and about techniques, farming techniques, whether it's lack of information, whether it's infrastructure obstacles in terms of their ability to actually physically connect to markets. But one of the areas that sort of continues to pop up across the value chain is this financing constraint. And I would hesitate to say that it's the single most important constraint, but it is certainly one that sort of continues to crop up, no pun intended, in all of our work. And so that's where, while the foundation has sort of has looked at individual interventions within given value chains, so say in coffee, for example, what are all of the different pieces we need across that value chain to really allow the farmer to benefit from the demand that's out there in the market. One specific piece that I work on and that I think we're here to discuss today that's really critical is finance, which is not appropriate for every smallholder. And there are different types of finance throughout the chain. So there's the processor level and the role they play in financing, which I know Willie will talk about. And then there's also, or the aggregator or farmer co-op, whatever kind of serves a big group of smallholders. And then there's farm level finance questions as well that I would say, have tackled less successfully and are just still developing our hypotheses about really realistic ways to serve those individual farm households from a financing perspective.
Thank you. For those of us who had a microfinance background, we often were challenged similarly with that. Getting to the end client is so daunting that you focus enormously on the intermediary. And I think, Willie, if we talk about this sector, who are the intermediaries and where do you see as their constraints in being, in that sense, an aggregator of resources for the farmers?
Well, I would definitely say that, again, on our value chain diagram here, that where the rubber really meets...
We have it in paper somewhere, too. Are there more copies?
Where the rubber really meets the road for... Where the rubber really meets the road for smallholders, and kind of the key economic engine is the small and growing agricultural business. And that business could be a farmer-owned cooperative that's involved in production. It could be a private enterprise that's working with smallholder farmers that is doing production or is doing agri-inputs or is working in marketing and processing. But I think in all cases, they do a number of things that are really critical. And just to beat a dead horse a little bit, because Dana mentioned this in passing, that aggregator, the small and growing business, basically creates access to these higher value markets by linking, and for smallholders produce, by linking into, on the one hand, global value chains. So for sustainable exports like fair trade coffee and mango and cashews and so on, but increasingly by linking into domestic and interregional value chains for staple food products. So for thing one. Thing two, and I'll get to the financing piece in a second, but reducing vulnerability of individual farmers to kind of price and demand shocks by creating this long-term trading partnership between the farmer, individual farmer level, and that enterprise. And one of the most pernicious aspects of poverty really is the powerlessness and fear that comes with that vulnerability. So how do you address that? And that's a critical thing, reducing that vulnerability. Third one would be these businesses provide often access to agronomic training, technical assistance, and value-added inputs that increase yields and income for smallholder farmers. So it's almost, you often see that the agricultural business, farmer co-op or private enterprise, is complementing or replacing weak government agriculture extension services. And then perhaps lastly, or second to last, because I'm going to get to it fifthly, right? Because that's what the Oxford Dons did. But fourthly, these are anchor institutions in the countryside, and they're often investing in really important community infrastructure, health clinics and schools and roads, and they're doing it not just out of the goodness of their hearts, but to garner loyalty from their suppliers, and also because it reflects their value. So a couple more thoughts. What's super critical about those aggregators, and which connects almost everybody on this panel, is that on one hand, from a buyer, trader, brands perspective, for instance, sustainability initiatives from the north, certification programs, sustainability programs of larger multinationals have to filter through those aggregators, through those businesses. From the farmer perspective, yay! From a farmer perspective, it's a crucial link of on-farm, on-the-ground investments in quality and sustainability and higher yields filter up through those businesses and get to the buyer and get to the consumer. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly for today's conversation, from a lender's perspective, you really are going to focus your credit underwriting, your risk management on the enterprise level, the aggregator. It's not as important. You obviously need to know what's going on at the individual farmer level, but it's really that your obligor, your borrower is going to be that aggregator. So last quick comment is, the challenge is that we have this underlying lack of financing for the rural missing middle comes from a gap in understanding of financial institutions, of one, those rural small and growing businesses, and two, these agricultural businesses. So, and then the last thing I'll say is there's actually a lot of lack of trust and integration of all these different partners. So how do you bring them together? That's why this is such a cool panel.
Thanks. Gary, Nestle is one of the largest buyers of coffee in the world. Right? I don't know where it ranks, but maybe among number one buyer of coffee in the world. And you know, everything from the Nescafe that we're all used to the Nespressos that many of us become addicted to, the machines and capsules and things. It's an enormous range. How much, in terms of your being such a large buyer, is this an issue that you're conscious of and actively involved in some way that gets you to the cooperative and below the cooperative and perhaps to farmers in trying to find them, and why are they such an important source that you would engage at that level?
Right. I think when you look at Nestle and the concept of creating shared value, it's about making sure that value is created at all levels of society. And when we look at the countries that you would class as developing nations, 73% of our factories are in rural areas. So it means we have a very direct relationship with farmers, whether it's milk collection centres, whether it's vegetables, or even coffee. And so today, somewhere between 10 to 20% of our global coffee is sourced through our own supply chain. So this is Nestle having a factory in places where coffee is grown. So I think we hired our first agronomist in 1963 in coffee. We've been working with coffee farmers for a long time. And we had allowed that to evolve from a local perspective. And what we've been doing over the last few years is saying, what have we learnt? What are the things that we can now bring forward and take this out on a global level and really work with farmers to understand the issues and bring an improvement in income over the time. So finance plays a part of that. It's a very important part, but it's certainly not the only part. So things such as government regulations, things like soil analysis, things like do we have the right genetics in terms of the right trees, training and availability for farmers. You know, half the time you talk to farmers and they say, I do it this way because my father did it this way. And if you can just help them understand the importance of pruning and regeneration, it will allow them to improve their income over time. So in 2010, Nestle launched the Nescafe Plan. And it's an ambitious program where we are working directly with farmers, with cooperatives. I think that the thing that we learnt was we can't do this on our own. And we need partners to work with, whether it's trade, whether it's government organisations, cooperatives, to identify what are the issues, what are the impediments for farmers to improve their income over the medium to longer term. If we can identify what those issues are, then we can identify potentially the solutions. And then we say, well then, what is our role? What are our partners' roles in delivering that? So TechnoServe in East Africa, the Federation de Cafeteros in Colombia. So the Federation is working very actively with farmers in that. So we're partnering with them in rolling out in 4 municipalities programs whereby leaf rust was identified as a problem. we're now putting out 50 nurseries, distributing between 4 and 6 million rust-resistant plantlets so that farmers over time can renovate their crops in order to be able to move forward and have a more reliable crop production, which then allows for a more reliable income stream. But I think Colombia is an interesting example because the Federation themselves identified farmers into highly technical, aged technical, and old traditional. And it's this last group that have what they would consider have fallen into the poverty cycle, because their trees are so old, they're no longer getting the yield that will allow the family to get enough income to survive on a regular basis. But they can't afford to take the old trees out and plant the new varieties in with a high yield because they can't afford to lose the income flow. So providing financing to fill that gap is a really important piece of breaking the poverty cycle and allow the farmers to make that quantum step up and get their head above water and then grow their business going forward.
And who provides that finance? When you get down to the farmers, this is really where you increase their production, their yield, the quality of their product, and their livelihood. Who provides that finance?
So when we look at Nestle globally, we provided finance to about 45,000 farmers last year. All up, I think there was about $59 million of financing that was made available through Nestle and through partners together. However, the bulk of that was in the dairy sector, because dairy, you're talking to farmers every day. They're bringing their pails of milk to your collection centre every day. You have a relationship with them. Developing solutions in coffee and cocoa, which are more annualized crops, becomes more of a challenge. And today, traditionally, that finance sits with the trade, because it's the trade that are going around and doing the deals and trying to find the farmers and cooperatives with whom they want to do business over the longer term. We are looking for solutions. We have trials at the moment in a number of countries where we're rolling out potential financing programs in coffee. I think last year around about $1 million was provided through coffee or cocoa financing programs, but we are still looking for the appropriate model. We're still trying to get the right mechanic to allow this. I also know that Nespresso through the AAA program are doing that. But it is a big challenge when farmers, you need to keep them free to sell to the best buyer. So you don't want to tie them down, but at the same time you also want to ensure that they have the ability to move forward and reinvest in their product to grow their business going forward.
So the financing can be a stickiness helped with the relationship, certainly.
Absolutely.
To the buyer who wants to yield the benefits of, again, a pun, no pun, yield the benefits of this, higher quality or increased production of something that's in demand.
Bob, can I jump in
Yeah.
just one really quick comment, which is, and shamelessly promote Root Capital. We did $110 million last
And he
year.
is shameless.
$110 million in disbursements to almost 200 businesses, and it was about 70% or so coffee. And I mention that because the Jedi Knights, in terms of knowing how to get capital to producers, are the traders. They are doing that in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. When the lead was flying in the Ivory Coast last year, they were still getting credit out there. And the question is, and the opportunity is, how do you take those practices and make them applicable to financial institutions? Because they really do understand all of the ins and outs of getting credit through, and therefore Nestle working with those traders, there are lots of secrets to, keys to the kingdom there. But how do you take that knowledge, and we've kind of tried to piggyback a little bit off of what traders have been doing for a long time, but pop it out into a separate financial institution in whose DNA is written trying to finance these types of businesses.
Rick, since we're on coffee, which we can't help but today, being able to talk about coffee, you yourselves have a process of also trying to get closer to the farmer. And part of it is also addressing this income issue of having a monocrop sometimes and the risks that were raised earlier. How are you approaching this at Green Mountain?
We started about 5 years ago looking very closely at our supply chain at the household level in Nicaragua, Guatemala, and southern Mexico. We worked with CIAT, which is the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. They designed a questionnaire that was taken out into the field, doing one-on-one interviews with small-scale farmers. I accompanied them to Nicaragua for a week to do these interviews. The questions dealt with everything from basic household information, number of children, levels of education, to how much land the farmer owned, to their income from coffee, their costs of production, had they thought of doing something other than coffee? Had they thought of migrating? Did they have any health problems in their family last year? And if so, what did they do about it? Did they have any periods of extreme scarcity of food in their household last year? And if so, what did they do about it? Every family that I spoke with in Nicaragua told me they had 3 to 4 months of extreme scarcity of food. When the results came back from the other countries and were all aggregated, the results were 3 to 8 months of the year that small-scale coffee farmers had extreme scarcity of food. So we began to look very closely at thinking about the long-term sustainability of our supply chain and frankly of our industry, and knowing that there's a global trend of migration from rural areas to urban areas with the promise of a better quality of life. And we felt that we needed to begin to address things at the household level where we can begin to give young people a reason to stay on the farm. And so we've invested heavily in food security, health, education, and also in terms of financing. We've been working with Root Capital. One of the programs which I love is one of the things that farmers told us in terms of solving these months of food insecurity was that they needed to diversify. They wanted to maximize their yield from coffee, but also grow basic food crops to feed their families, but also to sell at the local market. And Root came up with a great program to help co-ops build internal credit facilities for their members, so their small-scale farming members can borrow from the co-op. And we started to move forward with that, and then I began to get concerned because this was right in the midst of the U.S. financial or global financial meltdown a few years ago, when one of the culprits was easy credit. And I think the last thing we wanted to get involved in was providing farmers with easy credit without some guidance, because many of these farmers, as we learned through our interviews, had a second or third grade education. So Root has put together a system, in addition to providing the local credit facility, a system of coaches for farming families that want to obtain a loan to diversify, perhaps to grow more food for their family, or perhaps go into another small business at the household level, to have a better chance of success in this endeavor. I don't know, Willie, if you want to talk any more about that.
I guess the only thing I'd add is, so this is a pilot. Paul Reiser, who founded one of the most important fair trade farmer co-ops in Latin America called Proto-Co-op in Nicaragua, that organization has an internal credit facility, which in effect is bringing micro-lending, microfinance, to disparate rural populations where the traditional microfinance model, which is largely dependent on dense urban or peri-urban population, breaks down. So they're actually providing a fundamental financial service to individual farmers for 3 things, with the backdrop being they have super lumpy household cash flows at the individual farmer level. That's why you have the lean months in the off season. So it's for smoothing the household cash flows around production. It's for investing in on-farm micro-enterprise development like poultry or bakeries or other things. And it's for quality of life investments like getting a photovoltaic panel to swap out your kerosene lamp that is making all your kids sick when they do their homework. So being able to actually, it's very exciting kind of opportunity where you have the business infrastructure of an aggregator of thousands of farmers. And within the agrarian co-op, they actually build up a savings and loan co-op that can provide individual farmer finance. But the problem is often, as Paul knows, it's the biggest yoke hanging around the neck of the co-op is non-performing debt between the members and the co-op. So if you can professionalize it, formalize it, do credit underwriting as well as Philip Martin Brown does at Citi, then you address one of the great challenges that Dana alluded to at the beginning, which is it's all fine and dandy and it's super important to meet the liquidity, the credit needs at the enterprise level, but you're kidding yourself, as Green Mountain found out, if you don't address the individual farmer level, and this is a really important way to do that.
Dana, you get very close to that. Please go ahead.
Well, no, I wanted to pick up on something Rick had said about the coaching at the farmer level. And Willie, earlier you had mentioned the financial institutions' lack of understanding of the risks in agriculture and therefore being reluctant maybe to really invest in the sector. But there's also that capacity question, both at the agricultural enterprises themselves, when we're talking about really small and growing businesses, and at the farm level. And I think when we talk about financing the value chain, the sort of the side of the development sector that wants this all to be sustainable and thinks, oh, well, how can we continue funding NGOs through grant money to do these things forever, wants this to be an affordable, sustainable solution, but yet there is still a lot of support that I think is going to need to be grant funded to enable the financial flows through the value chain that we're looking for. So just to keep in all of our minds that while we are looking for the financial intermediaries to do this in a more and more sustainable way so that there's capital flowing through the chain, one thing that we, at least as a foundation, continue to think about is what kind of support is needed in the shorter term to really make all of that work and prime the pump so that there's valid actors throughout the chain that can utilize that finance.
Now, one thing I would ask a couple of you is, I mean, clearly at the moment we talk about coffee, the prices go up and down, it's quite volatile. Demand seems to continue to grow, though, for coffee around the world as we all drink more and all kinds of new drinkers join us and become more particular. One of the other challenges is traceability and the demand that many of us have as clients and as buyers. And you brand things as having a certain either certification or origin, and you can get even more detailed into the nature of it. How strong a force is that in bringing the traders and the buyers of the world to the farmer? In other words, you need to get closer than it used to be where you buy from a trader at the port, let me exaggerate, right? As it gets off and then you deal with it, you say it's Kenyan coffee or Kenyan tea. Today, people want to know, but from which mountaintop? And what was the nature of the family? And how many kids they have? How much is this influencing your need and interest in getting financing closer to the, or even getting involved in the livelihood of the farmer?
So I'll have a crack at that. I think there's two models that we currently have within our organization. One is the AAA program, which is run by Nespresso, and that is very direct. They have their own people working on the ground, working with the farmers. They've identified key partners who are going to help them oversee the program, but they are working very directly. So almost to the point where they can tell you which sack came from which farm that entered into that particular capsule. They're getting that technology and that traceability, and that link to the farmer is very integral to what Nespresso is all about.
Does that farmer, by the way, get paid, you think, on average more because you're somewhat dependent on his story as well?
Absolutely. The farmer signs up to a concept of compliance and an agreement to hit certain quality criteria. So a lot of the Nespresso work is based around existing principles with an added component on the quality piece, which adds to the value added piece to the Nespresso concept. But I think when you start talking about Nestle as an organization, Nescafe in particular, we are mainstream. We can't continue to work in pockets or just little projects here and there. We have to hit the mainstream. And we think that if we're honest in our approach in terms of what we want to do in terms of improving farmer income over time, we have to hit and do our role as a buyer of 10-11% of the world's coffee to make sure that that mainstream is dealt with. And hopefully that then our competitors will also join us on that journey. So in order to achieve that, we're active, we're very much part of the 4C Association, the common code for the coffee community. It is a roundtable organization at which growers, trading organizations, roasters such as ourselves, civil society are all part of a common platform, and that platform agreed a common code of conduct. And so what we're saying is we think this is a true baseline that all actors should participate in. So we are committing to making our coffee 4C compliant. In getting to that, the 4C Association or us or the traders that we are working with are creating 4C groups. So this is partner mapping farmer groups in different regions around the world. These farmer groups could be as small as 20 or 30 farmers and as large as 400 or 500 farmers. But all of those farmers are committed to meeting the baseline compliance piece and starting the journey towards certification and yield improvement and income improvement. But we get the compliance piece first. The more 4C coffee that we buy, the more traceability that we bring into our organization, because we know that the coffee came from that group of farmers who have signed up to the program to eliminate bad practices, that they have excluded all of the non-acceptable practices, and that they are improving their ways of working over time. That has a value for us. So we come back to the creating shared value concept, and this has value for us. So we now talk to our trade partners and we say, we will pay you X dollars per tonne more. We will pay you X cents per pound more if you bring us 4C compliant coffee. But we don't want that to go into your trade book. We want that money to be dedicated to programs that address the problems that we've identified in the key origins. So if you tell me in Kenya that the issue is soil balance, that it's too acidic and it needs to be more alkaline, if that's the problem, then what's our role to help drive getting availability of lime to the farmers to help them get the soil balance right? That could be a key step to allow farmer income, so yield improvement, thereby farmer income improvement over time. But by doing that, every year that the trade sell us more 4C compliant coffee, the pot gets bigger. There are more communities that are touched, so we start to ramp it up. So our ambition, and what we've stated publicly, is that all of the coffee that comes through our own supply chain by 2015 will be 100% 4C compliant. We're out there building 4C units, working with trade partners to build 4C units to make sure that the world as a coffee community reaches this as a common baseline, from which then Rainforest Alliance, Fair Trade, UTS can then complement that with specific certification programs on top of that.
Rick, do you find similar strategy or need?
Yeah, thank you, Bob. We do. I think we're very interested in developing long-term relationships with our growers, both from a quality perspective, so that we have high-quality coffee to sell, and we can help them better understand what our needs are, but also from a transparency point of view. And I think, Paul, you can correct me, but I think it was in 2010 we were the world's largest purchaser of fair trade coffee. And we feel that having that direct contact with the cooperative enables us to identify our partners, both for a quality perspective, but also for quality of life initiatives that I've personally been very focused on in my work. So I think the transparency is vital if we're really looking to make a difference on the ground.
Bob, can I jump in for just 2 seconds and give it a slight twist in terms of the question around traceability and bring it back to finance? We had fascinating conversations in the last few days with the Skoll awardees. I don't know if anybody here is from Kiva.org, but Kiva has gone through a strategic planning process where they're moving in a complementary way into agriculture and into small and growing businesses. And the fascinating conversation we had was building off of the leaders who've created in the food space, in agriculture, traceability through chain of custody audits, knowing where your food's coming from. How do you piggyback on that in finance and know exactly where your capital is going? And that's what Kiva has done. And it's very interesting to think that you have, like a Root Capital, and there are a lot of others here. I think Triodos is around where you can provide total transparency as to where that dollar invested as an impact investor is going and what it's doing. So I think it's just an interesting, you can piggyback off of all of these developments in the last 20 years around traceability and food and take that to finance and capital.
Mm-hmm. Dana, do you see this in other commodities that you've looked at?
The trend towards traceability.
And the financing, is this we've talked coffee a lot right now, but you've looked at other staple crops as well, and cocoa and other things.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of crop-specific aspects that determine what type of finance is needed, especially at the smallholder level. I mean, at the processor and aggregator level, it's quite common, right? Marketing, finance, working capital, et cetera. But at the smallholder level, one thing we have really liked and what has motivated us to work in cashew was that it's actually it can be quite a valuable crop to farmers even without inputs, right? So there's not a lot of annual financing need at the farm level. Of course, if you could use foliar fertilizers and if you could use pest preventive technologies and such, and if you had finance to do that, then you could even increase yields further. But there was just a lot of opportunity even without kind of moving around that need for finance. Where we see a lot of need in cashew is at the processor level, because that's a really nascent industry. So it's definitely, while we are talking about coffee, and there are some unique things when you talk about annual crops that need to be acknowledged, but then shifting away from cash crops and really thinking about domestic or domestic, not here, but domestic within, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, where I focus my energy. there's a whole set of open questions around what financing opportunities will there be where you don't have the same sort of assured markets who are willing to put contracts forward, a la some of the original types of lending that Root did. And so as we think about whether we want to use the word food security or whether we want to talk about just staple crop production for local markets, I think there's probably a whole other host of financing challenges that are going to arise, and some of the models that we have for cash crops may be relevant, but I don't know. And Willie, I actually guess I would throw it to you because I know you all are thinking about what are the needs in the agricultural chains from a staple crop and local market perspective. And then there's a whole question of hedging and currency risk that comes in if you're a Root Capital and you're capitalized in dollars, right?
So what's really interesting is that we as an organization were actually inspired directly by Rick Pizer, Green Mountain, but particularly Rick, who has driven kind of the spear point at Green Mountain on corporate social responsibility and so on, is around food security, as he explained. And that inspired us to say, and this was a few years ago now, we are, maybe to our detriment, we spent 10 years developing a core competency in agricultural value chain finance for sustainable export crops and markets. But can we take that same core competency and move into an adjacent market, in some respects, which is a much tougher nut to crack, which is local food and agricultural systems and staple crops and agro inputs, higher yielding seeds and drip irrigation and primary production of millet and sorghum and beans and rice and agro-processors, et cetera. And we launched a food security and nutrition portfolio. And I think we did 12 loans last year. One of our investors, for instance, is General Mills, who has, to the question around how do you pay? How do you pay for the technical assistance, the public good delivery that's needed to address market failures around capacity development? Well, General Mills has got a technical philanthropy strategy where they're taking thousands and thousands of woman and man pro bono hours of technicians in Minneapolis and food scientists and machinists who know more about extruders and like making Cocoa Puffs than anybody in the world, and helping agro-processors, mom and pop shops across sub-Saharan Africa to address food security in the most profound way. So they made a loan to us of $1 million at 0% over 5 years to help seed, and Gates helped us with this as well, to help seed us kind of going into an ultimate skunk works mode where we say, can we do this? And it's cash flow lending. It is agricultural value chain lending, but you don't have an offtake agreement that's dollarized or pound sterling. You're not in bed with Nespresso or Green Mountain. You have a seed company we're working with in Tanzania. The revenue model is they're selling through a very disaggregated network of agro dealers, selling seeds in little bags, sachets to 1 acre farmers. Anyway, so there's all sorts of, and then there's of course the foreign currency issues that you have to deal with. You have a natural currency risk or currency hedge when you're doing export crops that are contracted in dollars, et cetera. So it's been really interesting, fun. It's still early days, but I don't know if you all have any thoughts on this around your work as buyers and brands, but for us, we're committed to it.
Yeah, I think from a Nestle perspective, there's an array of challenges, whether it's by spend category or by even within the category, country by country, the issues that constrain are, it's never ending. I spent over 16 months traveling around country by country just to understand what's baseline today. Before we even got close to launching the Nescafe plan, it was what do we need to do? How do we get there? What are the issues that we need to overcome? And where cooperatives exist, it's kind of an easy door to start to build the relationship and work. But I can tell you in a lot of countries, in a lot of spend categories, there's a lot of mistrust. And people won't work in cooperatives because they had a bad experience once before and somebody ripped them off. And you go to Papua New Guinea and people get attacked if somebody feels like they're getting benefit and I'm not. It's a real it's a tribal thing, so it becomes very difficult to put demonstration plots together and provide financing or create cooperatives. So this is where I think for us, at least in coffee, the 4C Association allows us to band groups of people together to allow that financing piece to start to happen, even though they don't see themselves yet as a cooperative. They're joined together because they're all working down the same path of compliance and improving sustainability over the longer term.
I think for many, the fear of the bad experience of cooperatives, whether they were the financing side of it or the farmers, go back many years. A lot of work's been done to rebuild and to restore and to put better governance into cooperatives in a lot of countries. And maybe I can open this just for a second. Paul, since you're sitting right there, and if you could speak up, you've been so you can introduce
Bashful.
yourself, but you've been so involved in just this issue of cooperatives.
Well, there's this inevitable reality, which is if you have 2 acres of land and you stand alone, you're toast. You're a victim to whoever rides up to your farm, and dictates price. And so there is this reality that small farmers have to find some form of association of standing together with their neighbors in order to create economies of scale, in order to invest in productivity, invest in quality, to go more direct to markets with a value-add product that they've processed to some degree. Whether that takes the form of co-ops or associations or other kinds of businesses really doesn't matter. But historically, co-ops have been strong in many parts of the world, and there have also been many challenges with co-ops. I agree with you that in the last probably 10, 15 years, co-ops around the world, particularly in the coffee sector, have done a lot of work around building management skills, around investing in quality, so they're really delivering a value-add product to the most discerning buyer in the market. And that doesn't mean that all co-ops are delivering. Like any business, you've got all kinds of challenges within the co-op sector, but certainly I think we see that the quality of the management, the quality of the product in the co-op sector today versus 10, 20 years ago is dramatically different. But this issue of access to capital still remains an Achilles heel. Many local banks around the world just don't get co-ops, and they don't see co-ops as particularly creditworthy, even when they have 10 or 20 years of selling to Nespresso or Green Mountain or whoever. So I think the work that Willie and others are doing in this space is absolutely strategic, and we have to scale it.
And if I can jump in on the co-op point, I mean, as you see more and more trade and the traders, the private actors really reaching further out into rural areas, it could be a very positive force to drive competition that leads to strengthening of co-ops, right, sort of inherently. But there is also the risks that if you have co-ops that really can't access finance, but the larger traders can, then they're sort of handicapped in their ability to compete. So there's this tension. We're looking right now at funding the coffee sector in Tanzania, working through 3 very large scale traders. And there's a lot of questions around the risks that presents for the farmers. At the same time, it presents a more immediately potentially sustainable model than what we've seen with really small scale farmer cooperatives in the Tanzanian context. So we're trying to test that out, all the while keeping our eyes wide open as to the risks that it presents, because you've got actors that are not necessarily representing the farmers, but who are becoming increasingly service providers to the farmers, and doing so in some cases much better than the historical cooperatives.
Just to build on this for a second, and
Sure.
taking into account the interest of roasters and buyers and brands, maybe shifting to Uganda from Tanzania. We've got a borrower there that's a Green Mountain supplier on the slopes of Mount Elgon. It's called Gumutindo. We made a first loan to them, and this is kind of making the point how critical access to capital is and what can happen when they've got the right kind of financial services. First loan, 2006, Gumutindo. 2005, $95,000. Last year we made a loan of $2 million to the organization. They'd gone from $500,000 in sales to about $4.5 million in sales. They went from 2,500 growers to 6,500 growers. And why? Most importantly, because there was very little side selling. Because when the farmers come down the mountain with a 100-pound sack on their back, they're so cash strapped they will sell prematurely to a middleman at a fire sale price, but for cash on the barrelhead. So when you provide that cash, the side selling goes away, and all of a sudden, the buyers, the brands, they've got much more volume. And guess what? The farmers have income stability. And that means they can justify investments in productivity and yield and sustainability. And the buyers don't need to go surf the globe as much to find new supplier relationships, because they can drill down on that relationship, and they can invest in sustainability on the ground. And then lastly, if you're the management of that of that cooperative, it's easy to kind of say, yeah, well, co-ops are just corrupt. Well, when you can't plan for the future as an organization because you don't have access to capital, you can't invest in equipment, you can't invest in processing equipment, you're basically just catch as catch can. And it's a really tough place to be as a person, as a manager, as an organization. So when you can plan for the future and you're investing in biodigesters or processing plants or vehicles and adding production, et cetera, it becomes a virtuous cycle as opposed to a downward spiral, which is what happened with most of the co-ops in many industries in recent decades.
That's a really important point, actually, and it becomes part of the I guess, the story in terms of how you build that relationship. Because once you find a cooperative or a partner that you trust, that has the same ambitions and desires from sustainability to work with you, you're all aligned on where you want to be going forward. You want to work with these guys. You don't want to let them go. So then you say, if I'm going to work with you for the next 5, 7, 8 years together, it allows us then together to invest in employing more people or building nurseries or doing other things that will help that cooperative to grow. So then how do I have a relationship with you that gives that commitment over that medium to longer term so you can continue to invest? And guess what? There's more coffee available that's compliant to the standards that we want, that's going to be potentially flow back into our supply chain. It's, as you say, it's a virtuous circle. We get more of the things that we're looking for from compliance, from traceability and quality, and these guys get higher income, they get further investment, and the whole cooperative continues to grow. It's a fantastic way to do business.
And that's what some guy named Michael Porter calls shared value, right?
That's right. There you go.
So if we see that there's this great increase in value and income that's potentially there, and with the right partners, where's this finance going to come from, though? This increased finance, is it something that has to be shared? The risk on that finance between the buyers, because they have an inherent stake in all this, and in both having stable supplies and some stickiness to the producer. Is it the multilaterals, the development agencies, which it seems like a no-brainer if they would put capital out there? In terms of some of your examples, incomes could really be reflected, and access to market. The banks, which will hesitantly follow both their clients and the other maybe risk takers and the multilaterals. Where do we really think the finance will come from? And then I'll open this to the floor. Dana, where do you think it comes from?
It's interesting. I mean, I frankly don't think that the donors and even the multilaterals have enough capital to just keep capitalizing the financial chain, if you will. I mean, I think as we move towards doing that through, in our case, what we call program-related investments, that then is at least capital that regenerates. Historically, it seems like it's very much come from within the chain and off of the balance sheets. To Willie's point, he'd like to see some of that intermediated, and I think that will be important to really ensuring the farmers control over that aspect of shared value that's being created for them. In the near term, I imagine it's going to continue to come from the chain, and then slowly and again, I'm thinking specifically about sub-Saharan Africa, as you see the financial markets there shift, and that has a whole host of policy and regulatory questions around it, I do think we'll start to see banks come in as the sector becomes more competitive, and they can't keep just investing in mobile technology and other things, and they'll have to move more towards agriculture. We'll see, but I think it's not a lack of capital in the private sector. It's more a lack of competition driving capital towards ag, and lack of capacity and risk tolerance.
I think we touched on it earlier that traditionally the finance comes from the trade. These are the guys that grease the wheel to make the whole thing happen. They're the in-between the farmer and the end buyer, basically. And these were the guys that were providing the cash to allow things to happen. What we're seeing more and more is continued investments from donor organizations, shall I say project-driven activity. And I think what we're looking to do is break that paradigm and make it mainstream. And so if you're looking at the end-to-end value chain, yes, you've got the grower right at one end and you've got the shareholder at the other. But if the consumer doesn't believe in it, where does the buck stop? Is it the manufacturer? I tell you what, the shareholder's not going to be too thrilled if all of the cost stops at the manufacturer level. So it has to be the entire value chain. So in order for, shall we say, the creation of value, there has to be value in it for all of the stakeholders along the chain. So for Nestle, if we get coffee that is compliant and we have a degree of traceability so we know that where it's coming from is compliant to certain standards, there's a value for that, and we will pay for that. But then that allows us in a communication standpoint to share with the consumer that here is this extra value that's being brought to this brand. So the equity in that brand has been enhanced because of the ethical and behavior all through the chain to ensure that there's compliance and continued sustainability growth all the way through. So the communication piece then allows the consumer to believe in the product, which hopefully then the shareholder sees value that the brand continues to grow and they're prepared to invest in that company going forward. It's got to be the whole thing. If you don't address the whole chain, then at some point it's going to fall over. It won't be sustainable.
I'd like to open to the floor. And can you just say who you are and speak loud, please, loudly?
I've got a microphone.
You have a microphone? Okay, but those who feel they can speak to the mic, go right ahead.
Hello, my name is Greta Thomas, and I've got a question for Dana. I know it's pretty early days with program-related investments, but would love to kind of hear more specifically about the investment side, the PRI side. And was it reasonably straightforward to make it sort of compliant within the rules, or was that actually quite a challenging process to make it work for the stakeholder but also be compliant?
Do you mean compliant with the foundation's rules and
The
obligations?
program-related investment sort of requirements?
No, I mean, so our charitable purpose, this is, I don't know how much you know about private foundations and program-related investments, and it may not be too interesting to the larger group, but you know, in order for us to invest, in which case we're potentially earning a return, I mean, we're an impact-first investor. Our objective is not the return. Our objective is giving the incentive to whomever's managing the money to return the capital and therefore make smart decisions, right? So our charitable purpose is well defined. It's all around, at least within the ag development program, it's all around smallholder benefit. And it is challenging because there's a lot of hypotheticals right there. There's a lot of theories. Okay, if we invest in root capital and they lend to a farmer cooperative, do we know for sure that that's going to lead to increased incomes or increased productivity for those farmers? We're not positive, but we have pretty strong theories of change there that drive us to do that, and all of our strategy is based on it, and that helps us to meet our charitable purpose requirements, to say we're not making this investment because we're going to get rich off of it. We're making this investment because it creates the right incentives to catalyze a sequence of events that we believe is good for the sector. So no, it hasn't been terribly difficult. What's been difficult is internally within a large organization like the foundation that's traditionally been a grant-making organization, to really get program officers who don't necessarily have a background in finance to be thinking about the incentives that are created by different financial tools, and also then to kind of be able to start to work with our CFO's office to structure these things, right? So, I mean, it's a messy process still for us, at least for me. And in fact, Willie was our guinea pig on the first.
Walk in the park.
Willie, yeah, he has to say that. Willie was our guinea pig for the first program-related investment that I made out of the agricultural development team. And we've only done two, a loan to root capital and then an equity investment into an East African ag fund. Across the foundation, we've done a lot more.
Okay, wait. Whoever's near your mic. Do you have the mic? Let's pass it along to this gentleman here, please.
Hi, my name's Rich Limesider. Most of what I know about this issue I learned in the past hour, so just a basic question. I'm curious to hear anybody assess the state of the field right now. So just curious, Will, you talked about distributing $110 million last year. What is the size of the financing gap right now, even in just those markets where you serve? How much money could be productively put to use by smallholder farmers? How much are they actually getting? And then how much of that gap could reasonably be financed by kind of market rate lending if the lenders would just be educated like these small local banks, and how much really does need to be subsidized by foundations or people who are willing to do that kind of high risk, low return lending that you were talking about? Kind of where are we and how's it going?
I mean, I'll take a quick shot at that, but I'll slightly duck it because it's kind of a question that makes your brain hurt. It's really difficult to really figure out how to drive that calculation. But our rallying cry at Root Capital is, we call it the 500 million challenge. There are 500 million smallholder farmers in the world who live on less than $2 a day, and most of them are mired in a form of subsistence agriculture that allows them to barely scrape by. So if you take that as your market, and you kind of do a back-of-the-envelope calculation about how much they need, you can get to a number of anywhere between $100 and $250 billion. So it's a massive market. The question is, what's realizable demand? It has a lot to do with the innovation that's happening with these two gentlemen sitting next to me. How do you create that realizable demand? How do you do it with local, local food and agricultural systems? But it's a really large market. And I think what's really fascinating and in some respects super exciting about Bob and Citi's keen interest in sustainable kind of supply chain finance is that, depending on the sliding scale of what your focus is on mission versus profitability, you're getting into a massive agricultural finance market. And it could be for large scale agribusiness. Bring it on, that's fabulous. Africa needs that. But there's also agricultural finance for smallholder farmers. That's going to be smaller. But what's really exciting about this, like microfinance, is that the toolkit for agricultural finance, value chain finance, can work in any number of organizations. So, we're very humbled to be working with Citi. But I think the reason they look at a little scrub shop like Root Capital is that we've been working for a while on how do you actually finance these businesses. And there are things about what we do in our process and our systems and our hardwiring of risk management and understanding the mango value chain in West Africa, et cetera, that is inherently replicable for somebody else in a different place who doesn't want to replicate Root Capital per se, but wants to use that expertise. So you're talking about a massive agricultural finance market, slightly smaller, but not that much smaller. Portion of it is smallholders. And if you can crack that nut, like they have in some respects in microfinance, wow, the impact will be enormous.
Okay. I'll jump over to this side. You have the mic? Let's jump over to this side. The gentleman with the glasses. And then potential funder in the front row. And I don't mean my colleague.
So hello, I'm Thomas Bjelkeman. I work for the Aqua Foundation. We build open source software for transparency and development aid. We're using modern internet technologies. And the question, or the statement that the consumer in the end really needs to bear the cost of this came up, right? And they need to accept. But to me, things like fair trade coffee and other things are really old-fashioned because they're a logo and there's no transparency. So what are you doing in, we can drill down all the way down to the farmer these days if we just put a little bit of effort into it. And we're doing this work. So what are you guys doing to provide that transparency? Because that will make the consumer say, yeah, I get it.
I think you mentioned it a bit, Gary.
Yeah, now I talked about the end-to-end process in terms of where does the value sit. So I think Nespresso is a very clear answer. They're working on getting that full traceability, as I mentioned, virtually sack by sack as it comes through, and they can track it through to the pod. And I think they've even got a system now where you can enter the code on the box and you can see the regions from where that coffee has been brought from. We have, as I mentioned to you, we've got a lot of coffee manufacturing in countries where coffee is grown. So working with farmers in the Philippines, we know who the farmers are. We know who's coming in and who's delivering the coffee to us. So in terms of the supply chain that we manage directly, we've already got very good controls. I think the issue as an organization is that we allowed every country to develop its own solution. So now we're bringing that into a common platform so that we have full knowledge not only about the payment piece and who the guy is, but it's also about how many trainings did he attend this year? Has he been part of the 4C program? Has he renovated his farm last year? So now we're starting to get a lot more understanding in terms of that farmer's desire to enhance his own livelihood and how active he is in bringing his own life and everything for family income together. So to the point I think has been raised, crop diversification. Sure, our focus is about coffee, but the guy's got to be there next year. And these peaks and troughs, one of the things the 4C Association is saying, actually consider growing something else. Don't rip all the coffee out, but I tell you what, if you can make your existing acreage more productive, take a third out and grow something else. So you've got an income stream that goes forward. But coming back to your question, we're using the 4C Association and that membership to give us the traceability back to the individual cluster groups from which the coffee is growing. So that's the basis. So today, every container of coffee that is shipped into an importing market we do pre-ship control before it even leaves the country. We know the exporter, we know the quality, and we've measured it and approved it before it's even hit the water and on its way to Europe. So we have very good internal controls about stuff from exporter onwards. We're now in the process of growing that technology to get us beyond the exporter down to the farmer group.
Bob, can I put a quick plug in just to build on this question for our good friend and partner David Griswold of Sustainable Harvest is here as one of the great visionaries. They're a big and important coffee importer, and bringing technology and iPads and other things to drive a lot more traceability and cost efficiencies into these direct farmer relationships. And just one other quick thing, we have a project that's called ABC Acopio Mobile, so it's ABC mobile stock management. And it's interesting because you talk to Gates or you talk to Green Mountain and so many, how do you get the individual farmer and in particular from a kind of a social interest perspective on impact measurement? How do you do that in a cost-effective way? So what this project is about is at the point of delivery, where the farmer comes into the warehouse to deliver their crop, they have a mobile phone application where, and a lot of this is about how do you, when you really go down this rabbit hole, how do you create reciprocity and user-centric impact measurement? So you say, okay, you all, when you're delivering your crop, give us this information on your household, on impact measurement at the household level. And in return, we will give you soccer scores by text message, and we will give you market prices by text message. And it happens automatically. And that's a very interesting way where you give them a reason for them to not say, God, once again, you guys are asking me questions about my poverty so I can then go sell it to my aid sponsors, or you can sell it to your aid sponsors. And you're all, as one farmer said recently, you're all crooks of the same family. But this is a way to create a reciprocity, and it's all about leveraging technology.
Erica?
I'm Erika Ishikawa from the International Finance Corporation, and we do invest in developing countries. And it turns out that we actually invest in many of the traders you all talked about. And I actually know half of the panel. So I have to say it was very, very interesting. This is core to what we do at IFC. In the Inclusive Business Models group, we have looked at our whole portfolio. We have invested $6 billion in projects that really do impact very low-income people. But the ones that really, really address this issue are the ones that we are doing with traders who are then on lending and doing a lot of capacity building with the smallholder farmers. And we do have investments where we then can get some donor funding to do capacity building, which we have done with Nespresso in Nicaragua. So we can actually get some grant funding from governments who really are interested in some sectors. And the key thing is to really be able to get local financial institutions to believe in this product. I think that we as a development finance institution, we do it because we can do project finance, we can do 7-year money in many locations where that's very hard to get. But ultimately, we do have to convince the local financial institutions. And it turns out with Gates and TechnoServe in Ethiopia, we were able to get, because financial institutions are also our clients. Local financial institutions borrow from us too. So in Ethiopia, we were able to do it where there's a partial guarantee so that they can learn the business is not as risky as they think. And if, I've worked for a bank, I actually worked for Citi, I have to confess, for many years. But to be able to train officers to look at different types of risk, that's really what is the crux of the matter. And I've also done microfinance. So again, microfinance, the ramp up, why is it so expensive at the beginning, and why did we have, as donors and as multilateral institutions, put a lot of money that was grant funded? Because to get all these people to understand the risks and to hire people who are the appropriate type, not a regular banker, but an appropriate type of person who can understand ag risk. The same thing as in microfinance, you have to get people who understand small enterprise risk. I mean, that's where it really takes a lot more money. I mean, it's a lot easier to do larger loans to larger companies, but if you're gonna go down, you have to understand the business. And I really think that the trust factor is also so important, because what we see in many of our ag interventions and finance is how do you give all of the capacity building, you do the extension services, you do the financing, you do the inputs, but the guy could just sell it to somebody else because these contracts don't exist. In many countries, you can't even have a contract. So you have to have trust. We have one interesting example is an Indian company. They're the largest exporter of dried onions. But what they did was they provided white onions for the farmers to produce. And white onions in India is not something that people buy. So it's not like they could just sell it to whoever it is who can sell it in the market. It looks different. People are going to say, hey, it looks more like a garlic. And, it's very bizarre. But that was one way that they were able to circumvent the fact that, yes, if you went with yellow onions, they could side sell. But if you go with white onions, it's much harder. So the trust is important, but some way of really making sure that the farmer sees value in what they're doing, and that you're going to get a little bit more money if you comply to all the things that is being asked, and that you grow together. I think that's the key. Is that there's a lot of things in the past that farmers have been really reluctant to trust bankers, and I've been told by farmers, I'd rather work with this trader because this guy ultimately is going to buy my coffee or my onion. With the bank, they can come and take my land away. I mean, that fear is so high that so far we have been doing intermediation through trading companies. We would love to be able to, do more business with financial institutions who can then lend. But I think that it's something that we all have to work on. But anyway, I think this is a great panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Wendy, can you pass back 2 rows, and then we'll flop over here.
Hi, Wendy Abt from USAID. Really a question here. We keep talking about the traders. Obviously someone is financing the traders. IFC just said they're financing the traders. Gates is beginning to try in Tanzania. How much of the financing of the traders is done by buyers, by suppliers, by companies, and who are themselves being either banked by a bank or raising money in the capital markets, and how much of it are traders being directly financed by commercial banks? So commercial banks are making the decision that the way they feel is the safest way for them to lend is through this trader, and that is probably being done internationally. In other words, those guys are not going to the local banks, they're going to the big international banks. Because it sounds to me as I listen to you that we're actually shifting the financing of this business. It is being financed. And we're not satisfied that it's being financed in the most efficient way, or that we don't like the way the benefits are falling out, that there aren't that incentives are not aligned. But it is being financed. Could someone just answer that very simple question?
And I think we need to address there's a range of types of traders, so we need to be clear on that too. And what they're financing, is it harvesting finance, or is it pre-production? So you want to give a shot at that? Rick, you look like you're there.
Yeah, we do some pre-harvest financing, as well as financing that I mentioned earlier relating to the internal credit facility. Those are the primary focuses, as well as some financial literacy training. But you're talking financing of the product itself would be pre-harvest.
So really, of the traders, or go ahead, Gary.
Sorry, I think every spend category, once again, will be different. So my background is coffee, so I'll address that. You've got major European trade houses that dominate the trading marketplace. So there's a number of major traders who have local operations, and these are the guys that are saying, somebody in Europe has sold 10,000 tons to Kraft or to Nestle or to whatever. I expect this local operation to find 4,000 tons of that, off you go. And so that trading operation is out there talking to farmers, talking to cooperative groups, saying, I can advance some money against next year's harvest in order to bring volume back into our organization so I can fulfill the sales commitment. This is kind of the traditional financing piece. The issue for me is that it is completely delinked from any improvement or commitment or other activity that goes beyond thinking about next year's supply. And this is the piece that we're trying to build into our actions, is to say, if we're going to finance you, if we're going to do something, what is that financing going towards? What quantum step change is going to take place as a direct result of this money being made available? And for me, that's the piece that's missing from the traditional trade financing activity. I don't know if you
And that's what is so exciting of having these brands, these buyers here, is because at the end of the day, when the brand and the buyer says our customers, our shareholders, our license to operate depends on making sure that there is a sustainable livelihood at the farm level. And not to mention, just from a risk mitigation, that you're not going to have child slave labor splashed across the New York Times and you're a chocolate company selling candy to kids on Halloween. So what happens? Traders, you know, there's a lot of different types of traders. I'll come back to David Griswold in a second. But traders respond to a market opportunity. But when the market changes, then they're going to change. And business, the old way of doing business was basically lack of access to credit and geographic isolation are used to get product at a song. Mm-hmm. That is what middlemen do. Mm-hmm. They are capitalized by way of, I don't know, a big line of credit from Brown Brothers Harriman. But that's not to be judgmental. Just the way, when the market didn't demand that traceability and transparency, then guess what? Like cataracts, opacity or opaqueness, I never remember the difference, starts to set in. So if you look at West Africa and look at cocoa, it is still a largely unreconstructed industry. It's very difficult for a buyer to even know what the heck's happening in the field. They don't know. They might want to know, and then you got to do what? Creatively disrupt. Who is creatively disrupted? David Griswold at Sustainable Harvest. Root Capital, a lot of folks in this room are creatively disrupting, harnessing market forces, but saying to get from here to there, it's going to take a little subsidy. It's going to take a lot of creative thinking. So last thing I'll say, just with respect to Griswold, Sustainable Harvest, we financed that trader, that importer, for any number of years, which was not our core competency, because we're much better at financing, ironically, at getting our head around risk with the farmers on the ground versus an importer based in Portland. But it was 2 years ago, a year or so ago, got a commercial bank to get comfortable with your risk profile, and all of a sudden you're getting many, many millions of dollars in working capital. But the bank wouldn't even lend to the importer because they didn't understand the risk, because it was agricultural and it was global and so on. So it kind of runs the gamut.
But I think also, I'm going to have David speak for a minute if you don't mind. But I think as we get there, they're remembering a lot of these traders, also those of us from West Africa, and things were so disruptive, the traders are maybe the very large firms, but they may not be the ones going out country to get the product. There are lots of intermediaries that they're aggregating from. And those intermediaries are willing to go up country and have cash. And certainly in Africa that was the case in cocoa and elsewhere, where markets became very disrupted, also politically and from war. So you had those who were going up country with cash, who were buying at whatever price information and demand was and how desperate farmers were. They were aggregating and selling on to the named buyer, perhaps in the capital, who was then selling it maybe on to a large firm and user in one of your firms in Europe. So I think we have to always remember that traders, and they become very often the least banked and bankable in many ways, because they don't grow anything, and they're not even the manufacturer who's actually a name brand who's going to you have a broader relationship with. They're brokers in between very often. Of course, there are the very large commodity brokers, which are in another league and have long histories and capital behind them. But I think as we think of traders, we have to really think they can vary very significantly. David, why don't you give us just a sense, and then we'll pass it up there.
What I would add is I felt I started in coffee 20 years ago, and I felt like the system was broken the way it was set up, and that you had to completely rewire how you would set up your importing firm. So the key was putting these kinds of things that you have to be, I guess, sort of an impact trader, impact first trader. And what a great thing I've gotten out of Skoll. First time, and now I've got a way to describe my business. Because if you decide to put money back into your supply chain, and on an annual basis, we put a third of our retained earnings back into our supply chain, into offices that train the co-ops. That's different than the other traders who set up mills to buy coffee from the atomized farmers out there. So that's a huge difference of how you're dealing. One is supporting small businesses, which are the co-ops, the aggregators. The other one is a multinational that's buying the product from small independent, the one that Paul Rice was describing, the guy with 2 acres of land by himself.
So I guess that's what you have to think about, is how do you rewire the system and say we're going to build it from the ground up with an idea of putting finance in the hand of, in the control of the small and medium-sized enterprises. And going back to Paul, that's kind of the key of what makes the difference, I think, in your model.
I think this gentleman, you've been waiting. Yeah.
I just
go
want to
ahead.
make one last point to Wendy's question. One clarification: we actually aren't financing traders in terms of providing them with capital, working capital, et cetera. We're funding activities to help them build out their ability to provide certain services to farmers. And part of why we're doing that is because they have access to finance. And whether they would want more, is a different question. But in this particular case, we were kind of looking at the sector and saying, okay, we see all the financing constraints with some of these smaller scale actors, and we've done a lot of work via TechnoServe to support those. What can we do, and what promise is there in working with some of these already well-financed larger organizations, understanding some of their historical roles they played in the market, but seeing a shift happening to greater service provision? So just a clarifying point.
And then we'll pass.
My name's Adam Green. I'm a reporter for This Is Africa magazine at the Financial Times. I had a question for Gary. You'd mentioned in your presentation bad practices among growers and the kinds of things that you might do to help them. And you'd mentioned one example in Kenya. I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more about what some of those practices are, and concretely, and what you guys can do to help.
Right. I think every country, as I mentioned, is different. The impediments for farmer household income growth will vary from country to country. So when you're specifically looking at Kenya, we go to Kenya because the coffee quality is excellent. And I've spent some time meeting with farmer training organizations, meeting with the different cooperatives. And the first thing I go there when I meet with the cooperatives is congratulate the farmers on the quality of the coffee that comes out of Kenya. It's fantastic. The issue is they present you with a couple of handfuls of beans. And for a farm to succeed, it needs to take that quality and replicate it and bring, I could be wrong here on the statistics, but I think globally the world average is around about 800 kilos per hectare. Kenya is around about between 300 and 500 kilos per hectare. So it's well below the global average. If I go to Vietnam, it's 2 tons per hectare. So there is a massive opportunity, not even to get to best in class, but just to get above global average. If you can move Kenyan farmers to above 800 kilos per hectare, they're doubling their income. So the yield opportunity is immense. So helping the farmers to understand and overcome the impediments to income improvement through yield, for example. So what can improve your income? It's quality and it's quantity. Then you manage your costs. You get some of these things right, your income for the family improves. So for us, a lot of the soil in Kenya is already acidic, and they're chucking fertilizer on that's got more acid. So they're not helping the tree to produce the material that will help them to survive or lift their game up. So what we're looking at is what is the solution to help the distribution of lime in an effective way that will allow for the soil balance and the trees to actually propagate in a more effective way. So if we can help that, then I think the Kenyan farmer will improve. Yeah.
You have right there, and then we're going to have you, excuse me, the gentleman with the jacket up here.
Yeah,
Can you pass it?
probably.
Yeah, go ahead, pass it while you're starting. Yeah.
My name is Kurt Elson. I work with a Netherlands-based investment company called Triodos Investment Management. Within Triodos, I'm responsible for the emerging markets fund, so we run like 6 funds that focus primarily on non-BRIC countries. All of them have a triple B bottom line, and so basically that's in our DNA and has been in our DNA way before Mr. Porter coined the shared value concept. And I think it's not really about trade-offs, it's about basically bringing the 3 Ps together. I have a question for the panel, and whoever wants to pick it up. Is our platform traditionally has been a microfinance platform and a trade finance platform, so we haven't gone very deep into the value chain. We now want to basically broaden beyond that traditional platform and attract investor money, both retail and institutional investor money. And I think we can do that to go deeper into these value chains. What we need is partners, for instance, to look at the capacity issue, because I think that's a huge issue. You can pump as much money into it as you want, but if you don't raise capacity at the levels as the panel has been discussing, this is not going to work. So my question to you would be, how can we work better with you and others as a private investment manager to play a more meaningful role there and channel investment money right where you want to have it, but with support also in terms of capacity.
Okay. One of you responded, and I think you ought to meet together with Dirk afterwards too, some of you, because I think his firm is so well known in those other areas that he's spoken about for very, as you say, for many more years than value chain, than this was discussed. So much to answer, Bob.
I mean, I'll take it from one very narrow perspective, which is, you know, as Root Capital, we walk in the shadow or stand on the shoulders of the Triodoses and the Oiko Credits, the shared interests, et cetera, of the world have been doing this for a lot longer than we have. And I would say, you know, most important thing vis-a-vis a Root Capital and a Triodos is when you're a pure play, triple bottom line player, and it's all about the farmers, that if we learn anything from microfinance, the good and the learnings is that we need to create the collaborative behavior, the unified voice, the advocacy platform, the standards, the best practices, the pathological collaboration with our would-be competitors to make sure that we don't end up in 10 or 15 years with an Andhra Pradesh on our hands. So I think that's something that's nascent but happening. Super important, I think, for all of us, because you know, we should be, to an extent, working ourselves out of a job in certain parts of the market. We should not be competing on price or other things in other parts of the market. So I'd say that, you know, not kumbaya, but pathological collaboration.
You have the last question or comment.
So I'm Jason Clay with WWF. Questions are, is any standard that you know of actually developed and focused on productivity? Does any standard of all the different certification programs have an emphasis on productivity? Does any measure childhood stunting in the family that's selling the product? And finally, are any of you looking at climate change and weather variability as a risk?
Okay.
Sorry, what was the second part to the question? Sorry.
Child
Stunting. 40% of West African children are stunted. Can you have certified products coming out of those families?
When we was looking at the Nescafe plan, we felt that there was a piece missing, which is about farmer income. And so most of the sustainability programs are built on 3 pillars, which is about the environment, it's about social, and it's economic. And what we were trying to do was bring a 4th pillar in terms of how do we bring the whole thing together. So I think some of the discussions that have been going on across rainforests, UTS, and fair trade. They, I think, last year put a statement together that the 3 of them are working more closely to align some of the standards that they've been developing. On the 3rd point, I know that climate change is an active discussion where new criteria are looking to be added to a lot of those platforms. The 4C Association has in final draft form, I think, I don't know that it's been released yet, on climate change activities and evaluation of things going forward. From a Nestlé perspective, we have a research and development center in Europe where we have been looking at what are the varieties of coffee and cocoa that exist in drier conditions and continue to reproduce cherry and pod, so that we can look at the right varieties, so that as the world progresses, we don't need to realign where these things are grown, but actually have the right varieties that can exist and produce in the right conditions. So they're the things that we've been focusing on. I do know that UTS and Fairtrade and Rainforest Alliance have all been looking, along with 4C, at climate change. It's a very live discussion at the moment.
I think I'm going to just do this. This is a great audience, and we've just gone over even our extended period, and I know you're going to want to have lunch. I want to thank everybody on the panel. Thank you for bearing with my croaky voice. And again, thank you for the participation. I hope you'll get a chance to speak more. Thank you.